So we're here today because we're going to talk about the AI landscape, which, as we all know, is changing rapidly. But it also needs to be secured as well. So we're going to delve into securing this AI landscape too. And to have this conversation, I'm going to be hosting. I'm Elaine Burke, the host of the For Tech's Sake podcast. But the least they hear from me in this conversation, I think the better, because we have two experts here to bring us through this, a guided tour of the AI landscape. Daniel Kendzior, who serves as the Global Data and Artificial Intelligence Security Leader for Accenture, overseeing the secure implementation of generative AI and its use to revolutionize cybersecurity operations, and sponsoring the security aspects of Accenture's responsible AI client services. And it says here, your passion lies in integrating cybersecurity into product and service architecture, transforming it into a business enabler. So that's all the things that we're going to talk about with you, Daniel. And we also have James White, President and CTO of CalypsoAI, the global leader in adaptive AI security. James has almost 20 years of engineering and data science leadership under his belt and has worked in domains such as legislation, customer and employee experience, and of course, cybersecurity with Mandiant and FireEye. So that's your credentials out of the way. We've established that you guys know what you're talking about when it comes to this stuff. But where are we at now in terms of the AI landscape? And I'm talking specifically about adoption trends in enterprise and putting it to use in business because, we've had a lot of hype over the last couple of years. We've had a lot of people trying out these technologies and toying around with them. But are they being put to work? Is that happening now?
Yeah, it's a great question, Elaine, and Jimmy. So good to be with you again here in Dublin. I think when I look at, let's say, the Fortune 100, just to kind of box in, a bunch of large clients, all of them have really been on an AI journey for a number of years. Obviously, the generative AI component of that's been more recent, let's say the last 18 months or so. But what we've seen by and large is they've all run a number of experiments with AI, trying to find parts of the business where they could find things that really added value, reduced toil, and delivered better services and outcomes for their customers. And by and large, they have, right? So almost all of them have workloads that are in production with AI. Some of the experiments that they've done, they've also deemed that they weren't, successful. And I think that's good. That's healthy. It's being able to test the technology and say, could we use AI for this? Yes, but it's not necessarily the right thing at this point in time for whatever the reason is, either because of some of the guardrails that maybe need to be put in place, or maybe just the efficacy of the LLMs aren't quite there. But by and large, from what I see with large companies, everyone's in the AI business in one form or fashion. And it's really a matter of being able to scale and get more value out of it while also navigating what's a tremendously dynamic space, right? There's new large language models, new plugins, new data sets coming to the market each day. So it's very overwhelming for most large organizations, but very exciting at the same time, right? So that's kind of what makes this a super fun job and a super exciting topic.
And there is a lot of interest, but also we see from surveys of business owners, company leaders and stuff like that, there is also trepidation there because it still kind of feels like we're at this experimental phase. And I'm sure a lot of that concern is coming in terms of security, James, because, they want their business data to be secure if they're plugging into these systems, but they also don't want to be left behind if there is a big opportunity here. So how do you think they are thinking about that, addressing that? How is that coming through to you?
Yeah, I think the point Daniel made, and welcome to Dublin, Daniel, that our hospitality holds up. We've seen that phase where all enterprises were looking for a nail and they had the AI hammer, right? That's over, thankfully. And during that phase, there's a huge amount of learning, as Daniel pointed out. We've seen the move into use case definition really, really grow, where enterprises are looking at use cases and saying, is this an apt choice for AI? And then from that, they go through the regular journey of figuring out which model is best. The ROI has to be established up front, right? That's critical. And then understanding what is the cost to run this thing. And that's where usually security comes in. It's often an afterthought, but when you factor in the cost of running AI, you need to budget for your team, your staffing. You need to budget for your security, the runtime of these models. And a lot of these models are built and price pointed at the actual token size, which is the number of inputs and outputs the model generates. And so when you factor all of that in, it's really a big project, especially the first couple of projects that go through your enterprise. Once you build up that muscle memory, you get into a routine where we understand which models work best for our enterprise. And as Daniel pointed out, the data, which data are we using and how are we using it? And because remember, key to all of AI usage is data. and you fall under the existing regulation of data when you're using it with AI or not. So GDPR, the California Consumer Act, etc. And so your existing considerations that you have for your enterprise software hold for the new AI applications, but then you've got additional complications on top of that to make sure that these new AI products, services, whatever way you're utilizing AI in your enterprise, that they are secure for your users internally and externally. And so the very first thing we've seen work really, really well is where an AI expert group is formed inside an organization. And I know indeed Daniel's part of many of those groups where you've got key stakeholders from legal teams, security, the product owners, finance, and of course, a concise representation of what the company wants to do for a quarter or a yearly basis. And all of that's factored in then. And the solution of that is a multifaceted model, use case, application, and security solution.
Is that like, can you tell us a bit about that experience on AI expert groups? Like, is that bigger companies are bringing people in externally to advise on these things? And is there a mix of internal people involved too?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, with any type of emerging technology, so we saw this with cloud, we're seeing this now with AI. I think we'll see it with other, technologies as they continue to evolve. When you have such niche skills and kind of a need for really kind of cross-functional thinking with something that's very emerging. We're seeing a lot of organizations pull together these centers of excellence, and they can be a combination of cross-functional stakeholders, security, privacy, legal, architecture, operations, and then also you pulling in external partnerships, right? So that can be either from university, it can be from large advisory partners, emerging technology players, et cetera. But I do think that pattern I'm seeing work quite well, right? Because in an area that's so dynamic, you need to have kind of a mixing of different thoughts and ideas, and also folks that really understand how the business works today. Because you can come up with a lot of really cool things on a whiteboard that don't always translate as well or as eloquently from a technology perspective. And so we do see security actually taking a really leading role in a lot of those groups, right? So I have a number of clients where the CISO is actually the chair of them. Not necessarily because, they all sat around and said, oh, we think security needs to lead this. But a lot of times the experience that chief information security officers have of kind of navigating new technologies, nebulous regulations, and then also resource scarcity. I think most of the security business is kind of foundational. You never quite have enough of what you need. And so in this kind of interesting time of FinOps as it relates to AI, sometimes that experience and that prudent thinking coming out of the chief information security officer is super helpful. And so I see a lot of times they're being asked to lead it, and they're kind of taking a very cross-functional lens. But I do think it's a model that really any large organization should really have a good look at and likely apply.
That's a really interesting point, that the person in your organization who is already leading on things like information security and your data protection is probably well positioned to take a lead on this, because as James said, data is kind of what's underpinning what you're going to do with AI, and there's existing regulation that they have experience navigating. And like when an organization, James, is kind of stepping out of maybe an experimental phase with these AI, they've toyed around with things, they've spotted that there are use cases that they can apply this in their business. Like how does that escalate the risk for them? Because then when it comes to, deploying it for their customers, like there's reputational risk as well as like the risk of more users, more data, and all that kind of thing. So how are they navigating that?
Yeah, you mentioned the word toy there, and I feel like Santa Claus has arrived in enterprise all over the world, and it's a really good thing. So everybody has been used to the status quo in enterprise for a couple of years. As Daniel pointed out, cloud was the last big exciting change that was transformational in enterprise. AI represents that new catalyst in change in enterprise. And so everybody has these new toys to play with, and they've been experimenting and creating new capabilities or making efficiencies in existing capabilities. But now, often the CISO comes in and is, the bad guy, right? So they're coming in and has to make it safe, etc. And one of the big seismic shifts we've seen in the last year is that the CISO involved at the early stages, like Daniel's pointing out, it's not an unblocker, it's actually an accelerator, right? So you have the CISO coming in saying, okay, here is the safe way to adopt AI. And once that's known from the start and adopted from the start, now you can run as fast as you possibly want with AI. And that's an unlock for enterprise. We've seen enterprise that retrospectively tried to add security after the fact. It's really difficult and challenging. It's still possible, but it's something that you need to understand what's already out there. What has the horse already bolted? What can we put the genie back in the bottle? Whereas if you do it right from the start, all your controls are in place. Your AI system, and I use the word system carefully there. So it's not just a model, it's also the applications wrapped around it. The data stores are in the back. So that AI system, that holistically is protected. And then all of that was factored in from the start. So when the kids do get their toys, they can play with them unencumbered by doubt, right? And that's what we want, this AI technology. And as Daniel pointed out as well, it's growing every day. Every month there's a new massive announcement. And so with all these announcements coming out, it can be overwhelming. If you have the rules of the road and you can drive in that safely and you can drive at a speed that everyone's happy with and that everyone gets to their destination in a really timely manner and safely.
So Daniel, you're obviously well versed in terms of responsible AI, and presumably there's aspects of that bring in elements of security because you need to be securing users' data and being responsible about AI in that way. But what other elements are there to responsible AI practices?
So yeah, responsible AI is a real personal passion of mine. I'm fortunate to have two young children, one that was born pre-generative AI and one that will have never known the world pre-generative AI, right? So I kind of view this as an area where I really want to make sure we can help be very thoughtful. I think there's a lot of other examples of technology where there's been challenges with that. But when we think about responsible AI, I think it's important for every organization to kind of define what that means to them, right? From an Accenture perspective, we've defined some principles, and we work with our clients to make sure that they're tailored for theirs. But generally, it's things like making sure that you're instilling trust in your use of AI, you're open with where it's being leveraged, you're reducing any type of bias in the data sets, you're being sure you're compliant with emerging regulations, security risks, conscious about sustainability. And so when we look at that from a security perspective, the security elements of that tend to become very impactful and also very cross-functional. It's really hard to ensure that you have no bias in your data set without making sure that you have the right integrity from a data security perspective, as an example. It's really hard to make sure that you don't have hate speech perhaps coming out of your AI unknowingly, unless you have the right safeguards and guardrails, and you can kind of see what's going into those different pipelines from an AI security perspective. So it all really dovetails very closely together. And as we see, the regulatory landscape evolving, it's still very kind of early days in that regard, but the security components of that are really kind of pull through across all these different dimensions. And it's just something that I think from a guardrails perspective and a policy perspective and a process perspective, it's super important for organizations to kind of connect those dots together.
And how impactful has Gen AI been in that space? Because you mentioned this kind of idea of a pre-Gen AI and a post-Gen AI generation, which has blown my mind a little bit to think of that. And it has dominated the headlines in terms of AI, but like AI existed long before that, and responsible AI practices and divisions and organizations also existed long before that. So has Gen AI made a significant impact in this area the way it has in a lot of others?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so to your point, responsible AI and trustworthy AI and those types of terms have existed for the last 6 years or so, or longer than that in some circles. I think what's really kind of changed with generative AI is generative AI has made the technology so much more democratized, right? You can really kind of open source a lot of it. You can do things on the weekends that now folks are looking to take back into their work life on a Monday. And so that didn't really exist in kind of the pre-AI ML world, which was really a little bit more rigorous and kind of confined to data scientists and engineers and folks that could really kind of get very technical with it. So now the fact that we can have, children, business users, academics, et cetera, kind of all working and coming together. And then the nature of large language models as well is it's very hard to really kind of unpack what's going on, right? They're not particularly transparent in that regard. And so that's where you kind of have to wrap process and safeguards around them. And so that's a little bit different than traditional machine learning and other types of data techniques that we've had in the past, where from a design and architecture perspective, there was ability to put a little bit more kind of transparency and rigor in terms of how things are built.
So certainly things are different, they're changing, they're evolving, but like good practices can continue and adapt and evolve with them too. would both of you be able to give examples of where you have seen AI governance done well, or even ideas around best practice in this area?
Yeah, I can give you a break for a second
Sure.
and answer that one. So I guess I'll start off with, you know, the home space, right? So we've seen Gen AI hit at the same time enterprise and home, and that's been really interesting because when you look at safety and governance, etc., a lot of times people who are used to using technology and work one of the same opportunities at home, and never the twain shall meet. We're seeing now folks have a lot of personal use of AI. And so they're growing not just at work, but at home as well. And when their kids are using it, they understand, wow, this is a very powerful technology for good and possibly bad. And so they start putting their own kind of guardrails in place, right? And they're just self-policing their kids' usage, their own usage, etc. And so that understanding is bleeding into enterprise as opposed to vice versa. And then we have, enterprises having to develop their own set of safeguards and regulations because they don't exist in government. Sorry, different jurisdictions are improving that, and EU AI Act, state by state legislation, the US, etc. But what we're seeing is, let's take artists for example. For a long time, artists have been trying to fight for their art not to be used for training models. And it wasn't the government that solved the problem, it was the AI model companies, the training companies. And so we have now great research from the US with a product called Glaze and Nightshade, which allow artists to actually be offensive, right? So now they can embed images that are not perceptible by the human eye inside their images, and it protects their artwork. So let's say they're depicting landscape environments, and they use Nightshade to say, this is a leather bag. It will create a invisible image of a leather bag that the AI model would use to train and ingest. And so when you ask for a leather bag, you're going to get a landscape. Or if you ask for a landscape, you might get a leather bag. And so these type of things are making it a nuisance for model trainers to have to deal with and force them to face up to the issue. So what we're seeing right now is that companies are leading the way, and people like Daniel are advising those companies, and we're seeing that landscape develop completely organically inside enterprise. Governments are trying to catch up. Indeed, we've seen the UK create the Laser Group, which is now designed to look at AI as a potential threat and how will they deal with it as a nation. And we're seeing that across the board, where this analogous nature of all of these organizations coming together, from the home life to enterprise to government, and the practical steps that people need to take are normalizing. And so the hype cycle goes way up, comes down where people are a little bit disappointed because of all the hype was maybe not fully realized. And now we're at the stage where people are using AI for real workloads, for productionized product usage in their organization, internal usage as well. And there's a set of safeguards that are widely adopted, such as practical ones, like putting a group together to decide which use cases are best, to another group deciding which controls and policies are put in place so that people are using AI safely. And then the data that's generated on the other side, the outcome of that data, is it safe for consumption for your customers? Is it something that you'll reuse on the other side for retraining models? You have that infinite loop type scenario. And so all of these come together into a maturity of such that 2025 and onwards, AI will become a normal tool in organizations. And the understanding of to safely adopt it, I think, will become spread across all, certainly enterprise organizations, hopefully SMBs as well. I think that will be the start of it next year. And then government will catch up. I think the US will put in place some good safeguards, maybe not law, but certainly some safeguards. And the EU AI Act will be tested for the first time, and we'll see the outcome of how good is it really for enterprise and for the safety of civilians.
James raises a really interesting point there, Daniel, that kind of tacks onto something you were talking about earlier. Like, we've kind of accepted we may have made missteps with other technology deployments that were really broad reaching, and like concerns about safety maybe weren't addressed correctly. But we are now in an age where these developments in AI are happening with a more conscious consumer, a more conscious user, a more privacy conscious and data conscious user. Does that present actually an opportunity for businesses if they want to really engage with people and light them up in terms of like the opportunities of AI, if they present themselves as a responsible AI organization and categorically can say that they are holding to those tenets, does that actually create a good business opportunity for them?
I think it does, and I think it does for two reasons, right? I mean, and there's a lot of academic and kind of industry data to substantiate a lot of this, but trust in services and trust in organizations are two things that I think are consistently pulled as top concerns, right? So for both as an employee that's going to go work for a potential employer, knowing that your organization is thoughtful and responsible in terms of how you're using emerging technologies, it tends to be very important, particularly if you're kind of working in some type of emerging space. And then from an end customer perspective, right, being able to make sure that you have trust of the services you're consuming, whether those are streaming media, social content, etc. We see that in polling data very highly. And so I think, while it's important to define the principles, putting effort and investment and resourcing behind the principles to actually implement the safeguards and controls, that's what really allows you to have that demonstrative trust, and then allows you to also communicate that to those different stakeholders so that it's very tangible and it doesn't become kind of just an academic exercise. But that in that end, I do believe, particularly as we've seen with so many of the large data breaches and some of the other type of research that's been done on different types of technology companies, a lot of customers are skeptical that their data is being safeguarded correctly, or that the terms of use that they're agreeing to are actually being upheld by the broader organization. So I totally believe that responsible, trustworthy AI is something that I've seen be a business differentiator and something that a lot of thoughtful organizations are really trying to lean into.
So James, let's now get into a bit of the nitty-gritty of how we secure AI for use in enterprise, because that must be hugely challenging, especially with generative AI, because it's a much more dynamic environment. And you're even saying like about you have to talk about your AI system, because you may have a model underpinning your process and what you're doing, and then applications on top of that. And a change in that model might have quite a substantive effect on your outputs and your outcomes. So, I mean, how do you even go about envisaging a security landscape around that?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the first part is to realize that that's all very overwhelming if you take it in totality. And so to divide it into two parts, there are the companies who are spending billions of dollars per year on training these models. And those companies have a different level of burden than you should have to use these models. So a lot of the fear factor around AI usage and training of data, etc., sits with those companies and organizations. They're not all companies. And so what you need to be concerned for around utilizing these models is the inference layer. So you're using these models for inference. You may be fine-tuning these models where you're adding extra data to the model, or using RAG, which is putting a data store behind the model to consume it through AI. But once you understand it's all inference for your organization, then you can start getting your arms around it and figuring out what's our strategy to dissect this and secure it at the different phases that we will use. And so the first part is always defense, right? You want to make sure that you're defending against threats that are known to be out there. Also defending against, points that Daniel brought up earlier, to make sure that the data being used is correct and valid, that the responses being generated don't have, represent brand damage for your organization or damaging content for the consumers of that information. Once you've got your defense sorted, organized, and that's usually policies and controls. And those policies and controls, to your point, need to be dynamic. So, things change. The things that are acceptable today may not be acceptable tomorrow, and vice versa. And so that's the defensive column. The second part is offensive. So for years and years and years, red teaming has been a key and critical part for security teams and organizations. And pen testing and penetration testing, different software. Well, pen testing models is just as important, right? If you have things that you're concerned about, that your model may give information that's not appropriate or incorrect or proprietary in some way, then you need to test that model and say, will it give information in these circumstances? And that's getting ahead of the problem. You might think you should do that first, but to the point of the dramatically accelerated landscape of AI, we need to defend immediately, right? Because it's already out there. But once you're mature, you can set up your offensive posture where you're testing these models regularly, and not just testing the ones you already have, but also evaluating new models coming in. So there's new releases of new models all the time. And there's open source models, there's closed source models, public, private models. If you're hosting this model yourself, if it's a fine-tuned model, you've taken a open source model and then supplemented it with your own data. Now the responsibility falls to you to make sure that that data is secure and only used in a way that you intend. And the last part, and certainly by no means least, is governance, right? So we have the technology to use, but we have to use it in a responsible way that is adhering to your jurisdiction's set out guidelines and rules. And so governance does not just apply to new AI governance, it also retrospectively applies to GDPR, the California Consumer Act, and a whole bunch of other jurisdictional elements across different regions. So once you've got defense, offense, and GRC all set up for your AI productionized adoption, then you're in a really good place. And the best thing to know is that a lot of those skills already exist in your organization, security teams. And I know before we began this conversation, myself and Daniel were discussing the really key part existing security teams play in this new AI field. And Daniel, you were mentioning about the importance of those teams being brought in from the start.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other part I would add, Jimmy, I think you did a great job summarizing the landscape there. The new architectures coming out around AI are evolving every day, right? So this agentic nature of AI it's coming out too, being able to apply security, knowing that you're not talking about a simple workflow anymore. It's not just a model, an interface for a chatbot and then a human, but you're going to have multiple AI systems coming together and being able to make sure you have those dynamic controls, knowing that maybe when you architect something, it's going to look very different in 3 to 4 months, just basing on the rest of the ecosystem that starts to get integrated together. I think that's what's super important for security defenders and privacy professionals and the like to think about when they start to figure out where the technology safeguards get integrated into the organization.
Yeah.
And how is that impacting maybe even the shape of an organization and even the teams that are being created around this responsibility? Because I suppose there's elements of governance before that you could have seen as a bit of a set it and forget it kind of situation where you could establish your policies and practices around use of a certain technology and how you're going to deploy it. And it was more static than dynamic, and you could just leave it at that and maybe review it every once in a while. But this sounds like ever evolving, constantly changing. Like, how are organizations building that flexible security into them and embedding it into their organization?
Yeah, one of the and I'll just call it out here. One of the unexpected new realizations organizations have had is when you launch AI products to market, there's an intention behind that. You want to achieve something. And what we're seeing is much greater success in achieving that intention. However, then there's a whole new problem, which is operationalization of that productionization of AI. There's a lot of big words there. I feel like I've won Scrabble in just one sentence. However, when you are operationalizing models, you've got all these new problems. So a unintended output goes to a customer. They ring the support line. What happens inside your organization from that point onwards? Who is responsible for that misstep by your software, by your product? Does it go to the security team? Security team may not have any knowledge of this possibility of this model of doing that. So do they contact the product team? Is it the legal team? Is there brand damage here? Is it the marketing team to understand why this is on our website? So understanding that when you put something out there, you've also got to understand and set up your organization to deal with things coming back in. And that's another maturity step we're now seeing. A lot of companies are getting really far ahead of that, but it all comes from that cross functional team that set up the mod in the first place. You've got all those teams understand their responsibility, what part to play they have, and understanding when something comes to them, how they follow that chain from initial creation, so the software development life cycle, all the way how it got out to production, and when something comes back in, how they resolve it and iterate. And it's a whole new world. The SDLC process is a really good one, but it has to be changed significantly for AI adoption.
And that's some great advice there on operationalizing secure AI. What about operationalizing responsible AI? What are some of the practical tools and capabilities people need to be exploring here, Daniel?
So I think it's everything Jimmy hit. And you need to add in some kind of front and back end type additional elements, right? So on the front end, I think from an assessment perspective, right, really understanding what are the uses of AI across the organization. And this is something that the UAI Act also dictates, right? So having that inventory, being able to understand what are the uses of AI, and then making sure you're removing either high risk or impermissible use, right? So having that intake process so you can even find it, put it through a process, but then also running some detective scanning because there's probably a lot of stuff going on from an AI perspective that's shadow in nature, right? Because it either existed before you had your process or just folks are experimenting and it's not always kind of surfaced. Then obviously putting those safeguards and guardrails in place to actually protect the use cases you've identified now that you have a better understanding of where they're at, what data is being consumed, et cetera. But then that whole ongoing monitoring perspective, I think, is super important because these large language models can drift. The intended use of the workflow can change over time, right? Some of the data as it's enriched or integrated with through a RAG type architecture can evolve in a way that, what you started with on day one and where you were at maybe at day 200 looks and feels different. And that's where those different principles that you have in place need to be kind of tested and monitored on a real-time basis, right? And so security is obviously one of those that's super important. A simple example is making sure you don't have sensitive data leakage going back and forth. But others like, bias as an example are more complex to test and require making sure you have the right technology partners as well as the right understanding of, again, what we define as intended use of this AI workflow. So really kind of rounding that out, the most important thing for an organization is because this all can be very overwhelming, right? And so you don't want to view each of these types of tests and safeguards as something you're going to run in, totally ad hoc of each other. That needs to be integrated so that when you're looking and talking to an application owner or an AI workflow owner, you're bringing them the full suite of, okay, great, these are the 4 or 5 things we're going to look at from an assessment perspective. These are going to translate into different types of guardrails, and then we're going to monitor them. But too often, I think, and this is one of the learnings of kind of security over the years, is if security is yet another check that goes on an already large checklist of different things an application owner has to do, it tends to reduce velocity within the organization and also create sometimes a culture where security is viewed as a blocker. And that's why we really want to make sure that we think about responsible AI as a package and kind of be able to take that business user through that workflow in an integrated way.
And chances are businesses are going to have to, as you said, engage a technology partner on this stuff. They may not have the expertise in-house to delve into this area. And as you mentioned, Daniel, like they are overwhelmed, because there's a lot of new language we're all using now. I mean, we're throwing around terms like RAG as if they've been with us all along. I only learned about that one recently myself. So like that can be hard for businesses. And even as a technology partner, James, trying to actually engage with them, do you feel like there's a responsibility on your side to even like bring them on a journey and educate them on what they need to know about these systems?
Yeah, luckily we love talking about this stuff. So we always start trying to understand what they're trying to achieve, the outcome. Because even though we're focused on security, the reason we're doing that is we believe AI is the future, is the way things will unlock a huge amount of potential that's just sitting there waiting to happen. So we begin with the intent and we try to understand where they're trying to get to, meet them where they're at, what they have in place already, what existing security practices they have that are already great and work alongside these new practices they need to implement, and then figure out the delta. So when you've got that delta identified, how do you bring in the security team, right? How do you make sure that they're part of the solution right from the ground up? And so if you think about why this problem is becoming slightly overwhelming for organizations right now, it's because I know as a kid, we used to always talk about the goodies and the baddies, right? So the baddies have been using this technology for a year now, right? So they are using AI to, augment their existing traditional attacks. Phishing is now something that was solved, is now becoming very, very difficult for security organizations to solve because the baddies are using AI. And they can use it really cheaply, they can use it at scale, and they can implement a lot of damage without having to put much effort in. And so it's unfair to position the security professionals in a way that they do not also have access to this technology. So bringing AI in as a tool or as a set of applications that the security team can utilize, that gives them the best chance to effectively defend against these new type of attacks. So what we're seeing is, one, we understand the intent for the organization. Two, we understand the security delta from their intent to realization of that intent. And then three, to Daniel's point, when it's up and running, how do you monitor and maintain this thing? Because in security circles, it's always been a cat and mouse game, where as soon as you've got something solved, it gets unsolved again by the black hats, etc., who are out there. And so what you need to do is establish your posture and then keep that up to date, keep advancing and upgrading your software and your solutions and toolkit that you're using internally, so you have the best live protection for your organization as AI evolves at pace.
And are there different ways? Oh, sorry, did you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to say, and to your point, I think that you raised, which is so true, it's such a dynamic, evolving space. I think it's important for every organization to have folks kind of focusing on the new, right? There's nothing, I think, more deflating sometimes for an organization I talk to, and they're really excited about an AI workflow that they built that's just been integrated into like a large platform, right? So they spent 4 or 5 months going through all these responsible AI processes, doing the engineering, pulling the data, to then realize that within a subscription that they already have, that's now kind of a table stakes thing. That's the world we're going to live in for a while, I think. There's going to be a lot of that, which is great because everyone's kind of pushing us further and further into the frontier. But that's where I think if you're a large organization, you have to kind of balance, going after the things that you have a clear ROI on, as we established earlier, understanding what that emerging landscape's going to look like, and then being able to kind of pull in the right partners to kind of get you moving quickly, because it's not really going to be a do-it-yourself experience for most organizations.
When organizations are evaluating those potential partners, like they will need to understand a little bit what they're seeking out there. So are different technology partners taking different approaches to AI security? Like is CalypsoAI's approach into that inference layer and securing that particularly?
That's exactly right. So what you're doing is very, very important, but also is what you're not doing. And so focusing on 3 specific areas that give them the best impact for an organization as they adopt AI is our critical concern. So the inference layer, so consuming generative AI models, large, small, medium, that's effectively where CalypsoAI come in to protect you. And there are protections out of the box for most model providers. If you asked, a large language model to do something that's illegal or harmful or hurtful, by default, it will try to protect you. And it will say, I can't answer that for these reasons, etc. So it does a really good job out of the box. But Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, they do a lot of niche specific things that are far outside the remit of large language model providers in the training area to even fathom of how to protect organizations from. So we allow you to define the best in class rules that everyone should abide by. So no hurtful or harmful activity, etc. But also the big last mile bespoke steps. So in your jurisdiction or region, what are the additional security controls you have to bespoke add on top to protect you and your customers? In the offensive plane, how do you detect or adopt new models and detect what problems are inherent in that model right from the get-go? And then if you're building, and a lot of organizations are, models that have their own data inside that, either RAG or fine-tuned, how do you make sure that data isn't leaking or isn't one of the nascent threats that they can't steal that information from that model? And then lastly, GRC. When those 3 things combine, you've got you're running and adhering to the laws and jurisdictions in the areas of business you operate in. You are evaluating the best model with offensive capabilities to make sure it's the right fit for your business. And then you're setting up the right policies and controls to defend against threats to your customers and employees. Then you've got that trifecta of security, that 360 model that everybody that's really taking AI seriously or building AI applications on top of needs to have.
So we've been talking a lot on the abstract, and it's great when you can say what are the core principles people should be adhering to in these kind of things, but practice can vary very differently from that theory. So what are some actual hard examples that you guys have of maybe good use cases, good examples that you can share with us today?
That's fair. I guess we better start making it real for everybody. So Um, what's really interesting to me are these novel use cases that companies are discovering, right? By not just using AI to create efficiencies, but brand new use cases that weren't possible pre-Gen AI. And so, there's major global companies out there. One such has created a assistant tool for people to get advice on their cosmetic products they're using that are fit for the problems they have, etc. And when you give a solution like that to the public, you're going to have three things happen. You're going to hopefully have the intended use case where lots of people can come in on anonymously, ask questions that are really, really personal to them, and get really good advice, leveraging decades of experience from this company in cosmetic usage. You're going to have, secondly, people who just want to see the world burn, and they're going to just target that model and try to get it to say inappropriate things, brand damage, etc. And then lastly, and this is the I guess one of the most important ones, you're going to have people who get accidentally bad advice, right? And so this is the risk of, you've heard of hallucinations in models, but you can also have misunderstandings of what's being asked, right? And that happens between humans, so it'll certainly happen between a human and an AI assistant. And so this company, because they're really thoughtful about how they're adopting this AI, and they're trying to make sure the intended use case is the only one that happens, they've put in place guardrails between the human being using this model and the model. And those policies prevent the model from giving bad advice, hurtful advice. And they also monitor that on a regular basis to make sure that nothing is, and to use Daniel's point from earlier, it's not drifting in a direction they don't want it to go in. And so that's all really critical. And it's great to see companies getting ahead of that and doing that before they launch a product, because they have an intent, but they also understand that it could be used in an incorrect way as well.
What kind of examples have you come across, Daniel?
Yeah, I can think of two. So I'm more of the consumer-facing one to kind of to riff off of what Jimmy was talking about. I've seen some organizations that have digital services for, helping advise job seekers and others kind of looking to extend their career, creating a lot of generative AI-enabled workloads where they can help create resumes and do things like that. Sometimes when we've done testing on those types of platforms, what we see is that a lot of the security guardrails are oftentimes put in place, right, in terms of monitoring sensitive data. However, the user is able to manipulate the AI system to come out with responses that maybe don't align with that core services brand or philosophy or things like that. And so you can create both a real or perceived brand issue depending on how the chatbot's responding to you, how it's framing some of the verbiage, etc. And so that's a perfect example, I think, of where those guardrails can be more honed for other things outside of just kind of core security, data leakage, and vulnerabilities and things of that nature. And then from more of an internal perspective, right, a lot of organizations are building different types of assistants, right? So it could be an assistant for your software development team. It could be an assistant for your operations team, et cetera. And so many of my large clients have got a very significant backlog of data governance work that they've known that they wanted to do for many, many years, and they just haven't kind of gotten around to it. One of the kind of unintended consequences of AIs is really exposing a lot of that. So the lack of permissioning in some of those underlying data sets, some of the redundancy or like duplication of data. And so what's happening is they're building these really cool, really powerful assistants and then surfacing a lot of fine-grained access control problems and identity and access management control issues and things like that they've had. And so the question at that point for the organization is, do we turn this whole AI functionality off? And oftentimes that's a bit of an overreaction, right? And so being able to put in guardrails in place and say, okay, great, we know we have either sensitive customer data in this bucket, or perhaps we know we've got sensitive data related to an acquisition or maybe a historical acquisition, but you can actually put policies in place to be able to restrict and validate that some of that's not being being consumed either by a prompt or response in the model at that inference layer. And it allows you to kind of move forward with that AI experiment, moving that into production while you go and do some of that cleanup effort in the background, right? So they're just kind of a customer-facing example as well as more of like a back office example that kind of real challenges that we're helping some of our clients work through.
Thank you so much for both of you sharing your insights today. I've learned a lot. And it seems like, even though it seems like it's a scary new world out there with AI and security, the basic tenets of good security practice still apply here. Bake it in early from the start. And perhaps maybe you'll need to be a bit more proactive with it. You may need to bring in some outside expertise to help with it. But, it's still security at its best is when it's done top down, considered from the start, and, do things responsibly as well. I'm sure that's a message we'd like to leave people with. So thank you, James. Thank you, Daniel, for all your insights here today. And if anybody wants more information on trends in AI security, I'm sure they can connect with you both on various platforms. They can follow CalypsoAI on LinkedIn or visit calypsoai.com.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks.